It's a wonderful program, and I'm grateful to Principal Lee and all the supporters, including the Consul General and people like Mark who participate in the program, and the students and staff who work to put it together. And it's also a great pleasure to see you teachers here. I have such respect for teachers, not only because I owe individual teachers so much in my own life, but I know how much you work and how hard it is, and probably sometimes how little appreciation you probably feel you get. And to see you come out on Saturday to learn about Korea, so you can know more about that important issue and something that's very important personally to a lot of your students, well, that's super special. I guess I have one complaint, though. I don't know why I always have to follow Dr. Peters. And why I have to speak just before lunch on North Korea. But I'll do my best with you all today. I am David Straub. I worked for 30 years at the State Department. I spent about half of my time equally divided between Japan and Korea. My Korean friends will introduce me to other people as David Straub, Japan expert. My Japanese friends will introduce me to other people as a Korea expert. When I first heard that, I thought, that's okay, isn't it? But it sounded odd, and the more I thought about it, I'm not sure about it. But anyway, I have spent about half of my adult life working in Korea or on Korea, or at least following Korea. I still don't claim to be an expert on anything Korean, except possibly how the U.S. government looks at Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and deals with Korea. You will, however, find many, many, many self-proclaimed Korea experts, especially North Korea experts. How many of you followed this controversy or all the news stories about Kim Jong-un and where he was at the past? Right? Were any of you surprised to find him reappear? So you have to be really, really careful, especially about reporting about North Korea. Of course, there are a lot of reasons for that. The North Koreans, because of the nature of their regime and because they're weak, they like to keep a lot of information close to the vest. And because there's a lot of controversy involving North Korea, you're going to find a lot of people within governments with axes to grind, ulterior motives. And because we don't have first-hand access to a lot of things in North Korea, especially strategic issues, you're going to find a lot of individuals who say, I'm a North Korea expert, including many, you will see their names in the established media. It's so bad, I actually, by chance, a couple of days ago, happened to look at ABC News website, and there is this 60-minute little feature on North Korea, keyed, I guess, to all this controversy about, or mystery about Kim Jong-un. And they had one, quote-unquote, fact after another, including, for example, that when Kim Jong-un had his uncle executed a year or so ago, that he fed the body to the dogs. Now, you may have seen that story before. There was never any sourcing that was credible for that, and since then it's been quite debunked by virtually anybody who's looked at it. And yet, ABC television news in the United States will repeat that, and not only that, there were one thing after another like that. It was just nonsense. Now, I'm not saying I like the North Korean regime, or that the North Korean situation is not very bad for the people in many respects, but you do need to look at this stuff with a critical eye. Look for the source. If you don't see a good source for it, it could very well be pure fiction. We have only about 45 minutes or so to talk about three big topics. So I've been asked to talk about these three. The background of the origins of the division of Korea, North Korea especially, and its people today, and the prospects for the reunification of the Korean nation. I have about 24 slides, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly so that we have time for discussion. Now, Mark has probably covered some of this already, beginning especially, but the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, what today is North Korea, or the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the southern part were part of a unified Korean nation state for about 1,000 years, up until, well, through the colonization by Japan, but up until 1945. And in the period of Western imperialism, the great powers, Japan, China, Russia, to a lesser extent Britain, United States, other European powers, contested over Korea. And there were actually two wars fought over it, the Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. And the Japanese won. And Korea was finally and formally colonized as part of the Japanese Empire in 1910. This lasted until the United States defeated Japan in the Pacific War. And the United States, I'm sorry to say, was the country that suggested to the Soviet Union that we temporarily divide the Korean Peninsula into two spheres so that our respective military forces could occupy Korea and maintain security and stability. The United States was motivated by a desire to keep the Soviet Union from occupying the entire peninsula. The Soviet Union, of course, is just, the Soviet Union, of course, is directly north of the Korean Peninsula and could have overrun the entire peninsula very quickly. But for some reason, Stalin said, fine. Because of this almost accident of history, in the period 1945 to 1948, two states arose on the Korean Peninsula. In the north, the Soviets installed a state modeled after their own, and they installed this very young man here on the right. You all know him, Kim Il-sung. He was actually in the Soviet military for a few years before all this happened. But as a even younger man, he had fought small-scale guerrilla campaigns against Japan near the Korean Peninsula. And in the south, the United States, which really was not eager to be on the Korean Peninsula, on the Asian mainland, in 1948 helped set up what was supposed to be a democratic government, but was pretty authoritarian, under a man who had been educated in the United States, Syngman Rhee, or Lee Seung-man. In 1950, Kim Il-sung persuaded Stalin and Mao Zedong to support him. And on June 25th, 1950, he launched a massive invasion across the 38th parallel, that was the dividing line in 1945, and almost took over the entire country. You can see this perimeter right around here, around the Nakdong River, next to Busan. That was all that was left until the United States and other international forces under the UN banner were able to rally and repel the invasion. This went on back and forth a couple of times. The first time the Americans and South Koreans marched across the 38th parallel, we went very quickly up near the Chinese border, and of course, as you know, the Chinese entered in massive numbers, chasing us all the way back south of Seoul yet again. And this continued through in 1951. Finally, it stabilized, the campaign stabilized more or less around where the demilitarized zone is today, which is close to the 38th parallel. And on July 27, 1953, we signed an armistice agreement, not a peace treaty, just a ceasefire. And that is what we have to this day. So the legacy of the Korean War took the division of the country into two competing states and made that division far more permanent. Can you all imagine what it would be like if in the American Civil War, if European powers had helped the South more and the North had not won and the two sides had agreed to have a ceasefire and an armistice, and we still had Confederate States of America, the United States of America. That would be a really bad situation. Well, and the South continued to have slaves. Well, it's sort of similar to what it is on the Korean Peninsula today. Okay, let's turn to the situation. Let's move sort of to the present day, to North Korea and its people. After the Korean War, 1953, until the end of the Cold War, until the Soviet Union collapsed, North Korea was seen by most people in the United States, and probably in most of the international community, sort of an adjunct to the Soviet Union. Of course, that was not quite right either, but it did off and on receive support from the Soviet Union and China. And North Korea's economy was integrated to some extent with the other communist countries' economies, received quite a bit of economic aid from those countries. And up until the 70s, most experts believe that North Korea's popular standard of living was probably better than that in South Korea. But you can't keep a command economy going like that for very long. You can mobilize the people at first and reconstruct the country after war, but there are great rigidities in that kind of a command economy. And North Korea began having really serious difficulties, if not in the 70s, if not in the 60s, certainly by the 70s and 80s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was no longer prepared to provide much of any help to North Korea. And the PRC, some years before, had begun economic reforms and also was not prepared to give things to North Korea as it had done before. The result was that in the mid-1990s, North Korea suffered one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the second half of the 20th century. There was a great deal of starvation. You'll see all sorts of estimates, for anywhere from tens of thousands to 3 million people. My best guess from looking at all of the various estimates is probably at least several 100,000 people died, if not directly from starvation, from malnutrition and then diseases that will follow that. It was a terrible time in a population of 25 million people. So ever since then, the North Korean regime has faced tremendous challenges. You've probably all seen this satellite photograph. I think it was taken about 10 years ago or something like that. If you see more recent ones, there's a little more light in some places in North Korea. What's that dot? Pyongyang, capital. And this area? Seoul, Incheon, the greater Seoul metropolitan area. This looks a lot like, we had a photograph of Japan, but Japan looks like at night. So you can see that there's very little energy consumption at night and also not so much during the day. So it's a huge problem. If you're going to grow rapidly in today's world, you need a lot of foreign capital if you don't have your own capital, and North Korea doesn't. And to get that, but North Korea's problem is nobody wants to do much business with them because of the nature of the system, lack of respect for human rights, and, as I mentioned in a second, the nuclear weapons program. Because North Korea has been pursuing the development of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, the international community at the United Nations, led by the United States, has applied lots and lots of sanctions on North Korea. And that has made it very difficult for North Korea to participate in the world economy. But there's another issue. The North Korean regime, its leaders, realize that they have a very bad situation, that they need to get help from the outside world, but they face a dilemma. They've told their own people so many lies. For example, that the Americans and the South Koreans invaded to start the Korean War, that they can't really open up without those lies becoming known. And those lies are about facts, or about matters that lie at the heart of their legitimacy. It's a serious dilemma. The North Korean leaders are not generally the wild man you see portrayed in the media, or irrational or unpredictable. They're probably as smart as we are. And at the top level, they're very knowledgeable about the rest of the world and about their own situation in it. They face a serious dilemma, how to open up or how to get foreign aid without undermining their own regime, foreign capital. I think that the greatest challenge to the North Koreans, however, is the existence of South Korea, a South Korea that is successful as it is. So in South Korea, these statistics are a little out of date. South Korea has almost exactly 50 million people. North Korea has almost exactly 25 million. So South Korea is twice as big population-wise. The per capita incomes are just hugely different, although it's very hard to estimate exactly how much the North Korean people will have in real terms. Just about every statistic you look at, the North Koreans are many times behind South Korea. Because of the competition between the two Korean states, because of the very different nature of their systems, the North Korean leaders look at South Korea with a combination of contempt and fear. Contempt because they're human beings, and they have their own system and their own state and bureaucracy, which all feeds into the national ideology in North Korea, which says that their system is the true Korean system, the pure Korean system, and that the South Korean system was imposed by the American imperialists, and that the South Koreans are controlled by the American military and oppressed by the military and so forth. At the same time, as I said before, the North Korean leaders are not stupid. And in fact, increasingly, information is getting in about the outside world to the people of North Korea. And they understand increasingly that South Korea is far ahead of them materially. And that is something that is a cause of fear for the Korean leaders. You've heard a lot about the nuclear issue. Fundamentally, the North Korean leaders are using the nuclear issue. Let me start again. The North Korean leaders say they have to have nuclear weapons because they're militarily threatened by the United States. Many North Koreans probably believe that. Having worked in the U.S. government and studied the situation a long time, I think the last thing the United States wants to do is to have another war on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. didn't start the first war, and if you look at virtually every crisis since the end of the Korean War, the United States' first instinct is to try to ease the crisis, to try to ease tensions. North Korea has attacked South Korea and U.S. facilities many times with military force since 1953. As best I can tell, the United States government has never responded in force, has never retaliated with force. And with some exceptions, possibly in the 1950s and 60s, I don't think South Korea has either. So it's not that the United States is going to attack North Korea. It's not that North Korea needs nuclear weapons to prevent that, as they say they do. But I think the North Korean leaders, some of them believe they do, and even more so, they don't have anything else. So if you're fearful of the hostility because of the nature of your system of outside powers, and if you're fearful of your own people because you told them too many lies, what do you do in today's world? What do you do if you're North Korea? So I think they've latched onto nuclear weapons as sort of a panacea, a silver bullet for all their problems. They think that by having nuclear weapons, they can, domestically, they can show their people how powerful they are, what a technologically advanced country they are. Externally, I think their immediate aim is to find ways to use the nuclear card to get the United States to gradually disengage from the Korean Peninsula, to weaken the alliance with South Korea. And I think that the North Koreans think that after they do that, that somehow this will mean the end of sanctions, their economy will boom, and they will use, as they've used in the past and to this day, propaganda to try to undermine political solidarity in South Korea and eventually somehow take control of the South. Now, that's not going to happen. That's ridiculous. But if you're in a North Korean leader situation and you're kind of desperate, you don't have any other way of dealing with these problems, you know, it may sound a lot better. Meanwhile, the people in North Korea continue to suffer from absolute poverty and a lack of what are regarded as basic human rights throughout the world. There is essentially zero access to the internet, for example. You can't get any foreign newspapers unless you're in the elite and with a need to know to study it. You really can't worship or engage in religious activities. There are a few show churches in Pyongyang, but only a few. And those of us on the outside, what the actual thinking of the top leaders and policymakers in North Korea is. But I believe that the North Korean regime certainly seeks to survive now, and I think that they hope that someday they will be able to unify the peninsula on their terms, not on South Korea's terms. They use a very large conventional military, depending upon how you count it, 1 million people in uniform. They have probably 6 to 8 nuclear weapons and are continuing to develop them now. They're developing long-range missiles. Their propaganda is extreme. They direct it against both their own people and the people of South Korea. They have engaged in terrorism against the South. They have engaged in actual military attacks on South Korea and the U.S. in the past. When I first arrived in Korea in 1979, and I think Mark had been there a few years before, just about every Korean you would meet as a foreigner would talk about unification. That's good, that we have to have unification. After all, it was only 1945 when the country was still unified, albeit under Japanese colonialism. But it was a very, very real and live issue for most South Koreans as recently as 1979. You know, I went back to Korea to work again in 1999, and I continue to go back regularly. It's hard for me to remember the last time a younger South Korean said, we really need to unify. And you will see opinion polls that have sometimes statistics showing majorities of the Korean people really wanting unification. Then you'll see others that show much larger. It depends upon how the question is asked. But my own impression is that a lot of people answering those opinion polls say it because it's, say, yes, we want unification, because it's the politically correct thing to do. Because again, I see very little enthusiasm for unification now on the part of the people of South Korea. Why? Well, the two halves of the nation have been living apart for so long. One. Two, the people of South Korea have worked very, very hard, and they have a very successful society, economy, democracy, and I think they're genuinely fearful about what the process of unification might bring. Might that be so destabilizing that it might ruin what they've accomplished? And then I'll mention it again at the end, but even if the two halves of the peninsula are unified, will it remain unified? I'll go into that in just a minute. Here are a couple of young Korean ladies. I don't think they're very interested in unification. At least not at the moment. Now, you know the current president of South Korea is Park Geun-hye. And she came into office a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, and she campaigned with a couple of ideas about the area regarding North Korea. She said she had a policy of trust politik, comes from the German unification model, a trust policy that instead of trying to, as had been done a decade before, to have some one big comprehensive agreement between North and South Korea, that's no longer possible because there's so much disagreement and distrust between the two sides. She proposed what essentially a confidence-building approach, small steps by each side to build confidence and trust, but leading to eventually ever better relations, including South Korean aid. She did, however, as her predecessor, continued to say that large-scale aid and assistance would depend upon North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons, something North Korea is not prepared to do. And, this is very much in the news, at the beginning of this year, she started talking a lot about unification, and it got even more attention because she said, you know, lots of people say that unification would be risky and bad for South Korea and bad for South Korea's neighbors, but I don't think so. I think it would be like hitting the jackpot, winning the jackpot. Taebak is the word in Korean. And, you know, it's still not clear what motivated her to focus on unification. Some people say that she was becoming increasingly concerned about the decline in interest in South Korea about unification. Others say that she was worried that the neighboring countries might think that unification would be bad for their strategic interest and so forth. Well, in any event, she's talked a lot about it. The North Korean reaction has been very bad because the North Koreans say, and perhaps they also think, that when the South Koreans talk about unification, they're talking about unification on their terms, which would not include the North Korean regime. So this has not gone over well with the North Koreans. In the meantime, the division between North and South Korea remains almost complete. I worked a few years in the State Department on Germany when it was still divided. And you know, even during the entire division of Germany, with the exception of a few years, it was possible for East and West German family members to exchange letters, sometimes later phone calls. Later on, East German pensioners could freely visit West Germany, and the East German government was delighted if they decided to stay in West Germany, which would then have to pay for their pensions. East Germans could, especially near border areas, could watch West German television and so on and so forth. There is no comparison between the German case and the Korean case in that regard. North and South Koreans have almost never been able to exchange letters, even between family members. The South Korean government has tried its best to get up a process at least of allowing family members to meet. And yet, North Korea is parceling out those meetings so rarely that the great majority of those people will die before their number comes up and they'll get a chance to meet. And again, this is not because the North Koreans are in the first instance bad. the leaders are fearful that if the North Korean people see how relatively well off the South Koreans are, that this is going to undermine their regime. So the North Koreans have never been willing to allow many family meetings. And I'm sad to say the neighbors of North Korea, of the Korean Peninsula, are not helping matters very much. We Americans bear some responsibility for, even though it wasn't our intention, for dividing the peninsula. And that led to the Korean War and this terrible strategic and humanitarian and national situation. Japan colonized Korea, and today, Prime Minister Abe thinks that Japan has been a victim, has been unfairly criticized by Korea and China in particular. He genuinely believes that. I used to have lunch with him before he became a national senator. I used to have lunch with him once a month. So when you have, of course, the South Koreans are convinced they're victims of Japan, but when you have the Japanese leader believing that he's a victim, we're not going to have much progress. So we have this terrible political tension between South Korea, a democracy, and Japan, a democracy, because both sides believe that they're victims of the other. China is preoccupied with itself. They have, and you would be too, if you were the Chinese president and you had 1.3 billion people dependent upon you. So the Chinese first instinct is keep stability, especially up in the three northeast provinces, the old Manchuria, along the border with North Korea. The Chinese are mad at the North Koreans. You've seen a lot of reporting. They don't like the North Korean government, and they're mad at the North Korean leaders, but they're not mad at them enough to really put pressure on the North Korean government to give up the nuclear weapons program. They don't want the North Koreans to have nuclear weapons, but they're afraid that if they put too much pressure on that regime, that there could be some sort of chaos or regime collapse in the country. So they're not going to do that. And then you have the United States, and we have two fixations, two priorities. The first is not the nuclear issue. Everybody thinks that because that's all we talk about in the media, and the government officials only talk about that. But what is really the top priority for the United States is the defense of South Korea, the security of South Korea. So we would go to war if South Korea were attacked. So our first priority is not peace. Our first priority is South Korea. Why? Because 38,000 Americans died fighting to keep South Korea apart from North Korea. No American president is going to lose South Korea. That would be really bad and incredibly stupid politically. It's just not going to happen. So our American first priority is defending South Korea, keeping it secure. The second thing is then peace on the peninsula. Because as I said before, the last thing the United States has wanted since 1953 is another Korean War. That was not a happy occasion for the United States. And then, I guess we could say third, the United States is interested in getting North Korea to stop its nuclear weapons program and completely giving up the devices that it has. The only problem is, the United States can do the first two, but we don't really have any means of forcing North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. We have sanctions and other pressures. We promised them that if you were willing to do it, we'll negotiate and give you a lot of good things. But the North Koreans have their own reasons for wanting those nuclear weapons, and they don't trust us enough about the goodies that we would give them, and don't think that there would be as much as they want. So, for the foreseeable future, we're not going to be able to get the North Koreans to give up the nuclear weapons program. And this basic situation that we've got is continuing. So just a couple of final slides. Whither North Korea first, and then we'll talk about unification. So I've got my 5 C's, and if anybody can find another C, I'm collecting these. You know, the easiest thing to predict, at least for a while to come, is continuity. You know, North Korea's situation is bad, but they've started to grow a little bit. They're doing a lot better than they did 10, 15 years ago. And despite what you see in the media, I think, having watched this a long time, it's quite possible Kim Jong-un could stay in power a long time to come. The Chinese, for 20 years or so, have wanted the North Koreans to engage in Chinese-style reform. Okay? Keep the authoritarian system, but, you know, be a little more reasonable, and open up the economy, and grow your economy. A coup. A coup is a real possibility at some point in North Korea. But, if you're in the elite in North Korea, and you know, because you're in the elite, and you have access to information, and you're smart, you know that getting rid of Kim Jong-un would cause a great problem, which is the whole legitimacy of the regime rests on it being created by Father Kim Il-sung. And if you get rid of his grandson, who do you put in ultimate charge? And will they be accepted? It's a big question. If I were in the elite, I would think the risk of trying to do that would for me and my family, and it would outweigh the possible benefits. Collapse. You hear constant talk that North Korea is going to collapse. And most of this is based upon reasoning by analogy with the German situation, the Soviet Union, and I can see why people would do that. Those were very dramatic events that most people did not, the overwhelming majority of most experts did not anticipate, did not predict. But North Korea is very different than the Soviet Union. It's very different than the German situation, and I can tell you some of the reasons if you like later. But historically, culturally, strategically, it's very different. Again, if you're in the North Korean elite, which has the overwhelming amount of power in North Korea, and you look at what happened to Germany, you don't want to risk collapse, because that will mean that your regime is absorbed by the South. What will happen to you and your family? You might even be put on trial for crimes against humanity. And it's different from the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the leaders of that country, they could be pretty confident that in a somewhat smaller Russia, they would still be the elite. There was no South Russia or South Soviet Union. The North Koreans leadership, the elite, can't rely on. Conflict. There's always the risk of war breaking out on the Korean Peninsula. It hasn't happened since 1953. But there are, like a couple of million people under arms, very close together along the DMZ, both sides. And the tensions are high, and the possibility of accidents leading to an exchange that could get worse and worse is there. It's quite small, actually. But you don't want to take that risk if you can avoid it. If there was some way to reduce that risk, it would be terrific. It would be better to eliminate the risk altogether. So, rather than unification, I've entitled this "Whither Inter-Korean Relations?" And I'm sad to say the answer is, of course, nobody knows. One would hope that there could be a gradual improvement in relations between the two states. That then sets the stage for lots of other, better things to come. That's what President Park Geun-hye is trying. She wants to have small steps to begin with, mutual reciprocal steps, gradually building trust, confidence, a pattern of cooperation leading to ever bigger things. Now, there are lots of obstacles even if you began along that path, but it's a logical idea. But ultimately, what do you get on the Korean Peninsula? I used to think that that it was inevitable there was going to be unification, because Koreans until recently had been unified. In 1979, they all talked to me in South Korea about unification. But as time goes by, I wonder, and it's not because I don't want unification. I think if we could have peaceful unification and it could be successful, it would be a wonderful thing. Not only for the people of North and South Korea, but for my country, the United States. And I think for the rest of the world it should. But because the divisions between the two societies now, not just the political systems, are enormous. The cultural differences, both are Koreans. But, I bet you that in many respects, the cultural differences between North and South Koreans is greater than the cultural differences between South Koreans today and Japanese today. So this is really hard. I can imagine that sometime many decades hence, when the situation has improved, and Koreans in both North and South Korea look at it, one possibility would be to say, we're one nation, yes, but we're probably be better off maintaining two states, but two states that are more like each other, but especially two states in which they have friendly relations and the people of the two states can travel freely and communicate with friends and family, like, for example, Austria and Germany. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying analytically, that's one possibility. Reunification is another possibility. And as I said, I think it would be a good thing in principle, and I would love to see it before I die. But it's a very, very antsy thing. First, we don't know that we're ever going to get into a situation in the foreseeable future, at least during my lifetime, when there's a possibility of unification. Two, whenever things start, and let's say this is the kind of collapse scenario that you read the most about. Let's say that there's trouble in North Korea. What's the first thing China and probably the United States will do? They will try to stabilize the situation because they're afraid that the chaos would result in war on the Korean Peninsula. And what did I say was the number 1 and 2 thing that the United States wants? It wants to preserve South Korea and prevent war on the Korean Peninsula. Not that the U.S. is opposed to unification. Every American official I ever worked for loves the idea of unification of principle. But our instinct is, let's keep bad stuff from happening, as Obama might put it. And too many South Koreans don't want it anymore. And, I think after all the indoctrination, as best I can tell, most North Koreans probably at this point really wouldn't like unification on South Korean terms. So let's assume that despite all of these difficulties, somehow unification occurs. And let's further stipulate that it occurs largely on South Korean terms. There's no guarantee that the end state of unification will be successful. You have 50 million Koreans here and 25 million Koreans here, each with wildly different political backgrounds and interest, and probably a lot of prejudice. There's a huge amount of prejudice in South Korea against the North Korean defectors in South Korea. You could imagine, politically, things really turning out bad for everybody concerned. So this is something I think the media certainly doesn't take this stuff seriously enough, and probably our governments don't think as deeply about this as we should. Again, I want to say a third or fourth time, I'm not opposing unification, and I think it could be a daebak, a jackpot. And it should be, because it would be the right thing morally and humanitarian sense and nationally. But it's really, really, really complicated. I've spoken longer than I meant to, but we still have a few minutes for discussion. So the question is, I said that the U.S. top priority on the Korean Peninsula is to protect South Korea. And the question is, from what? From an attack from North Korea? Yes, it is. And Ning thinks it's impossible. It hasn't happened. There's not been an invasion since 1953. But North Korea has engaged in numerous attacks, both conventional military attacks and acts of terrorism against South Korea since 1953, as recently as 2010, when they almost certainly sank in a sneak attack, a South Korean naval vessel killing 46 people. And then in December of that year, they actually launched an artillery shelling of a South Korean island, killing 4 people, including 2 civilians. So the North Koreans are fully capable of engaging in even larger attacks on North Korea. I know where you're coming from, or I think I do. The North Korean leadership is not suicidal. I think that they know that if they did something like 1953 again, they would lose. They would probably be killed, or thrown in jail, or executed, and their whole they would lose. But that's not the way states work. States use the threat of force to try to achieve strategic aims. So I do not think that the North Koreans at this stage are even thinking seriously about ever invading South Korea again. And I do not think that the North Koreans are even seriously thinking about using the nuclear weapons that they're developing to shoot South Korea, or much less the United States. But no, it's not entirely from fear that they're motivated. The states, under any system, can be quite brutal. And the North Korean regime has a history that makes it more brutal than most. So the problem for the United States is, if the United States leaves South Korea, we just have 28,000 people left militarily. And we have a treaty alliance. If the United States were to leave now, this would create great uncertainty and instability in the whole region. And most South Koreans would strongly oppose it. So this is not something the U.S. can do. So, I take your point that we're not going to see, the North Koreans are not planning an invasion, they're not planning to shoot those nuclear weapons. But this military situation is real, and it's part of a huge strategic adjustment. And if the United States left, the North Koreans, there would be lots of uncertainties. And the North Korean leadership still thinks that someday they're going to be able to propagandize and intimidate South Korea and have a popular front that used to be used. Look, I don't believe that can ever happen. But this is David Straub's personal interpretation of what the leadership in North Korea in their heart of hearts would like eventually to accomplish. If you're the North Korean leadership, with the kind of regime, the kind of history that regime has, facing South Korea, which is so different, it's very hard to imagine the 2 of you living as brothers and sisters and no problems whatsoever. They're in a life and death struggle as regimes, in my opinion. Now, it is possible, if everybody does good, the world changes, in 10 or 20 or 30 years, the 2 Koreas, North Korea's system might gradually evolve, and the South Koreans' policies might change, and they might eventually have friendly governments. It's hard to see that coming, and it's very hard to see it coming in terms. Lynn?
Thank you, that was wonderful. When I see North Korea, which is a year ago today, we had just done some war exercises, training exercises with the South Koreans. And the press in North Korea was that we regularly, probably annually, do that as a training exercise, specifically to trigger their concerns about their safety. So what we see is just maintenance of skill. They see as deliberate threat and provocation. And then that gins them up, and so they shut case on down. And what was in the English language North Korean newspapers was that we keep doing that, both to threaten them, but also to ensure that they keep spending a lot of their money on maintaining their own military stuff as a way of being able to withstand the obvious threat that we were posing. And we were doing that as a way of compromising their otherwise about to soar economic boom.
There are grains of truth in that. But of course, then there are other things that are true, which is that the North Koreans are very good propagandists. So they know what will appeal to us. So they read the South Korean media, they read the American media, they watch closely statements by U.S. and other foreign officials, and they craft that into a message that sounds as plausible as they think they can make it. So it's certainly true that the U.S. and South Korea use military exercises to put some pressure on the North Koreans, to make sure the North Koreans, but also to make sure the North Koreans know you shouldn't try any large-scale military attack. It's also true, on the other hand, the North Koreans have a massive military establishment. They have special forces. They send those forces in raids across the DMZ. In recent years, not lethal, but not too many years ago, etc., etc. So there's some truth to what they're saying, but there are many other aspects of it as well. If you look at it from a broader perspective, this is the kind of situation you get when you have two hostile systems facing each other on that strategic chessboard. I'm sorry, you were asking.
No, I'm a teacher. Before you were talking about the neighbors not cooperating, and you mentioned that Japan felt it was a victim. Can you explain that? Why would they feel they are victims?
It's not all Japanese. I was referring especially to Prime Minister Abe and the people around him, and some on the right wing. Abe's grandfather was part of the establishment during World War II, so there's a family tie there. Human beings are human beings. We justify, self-justify virtually everything we do. I've read in prison, every prisoner in the United States has been wrongly imprisoned, because we justify this. So Abe's, he sort of feels this way. Japan went to war with the United States because the U.S. was strangling Japan with cutting off all its oil. Japan had no choice. Then we lose in the war, and the United States rejects anything but absolute surrender. And then they occupy us for 8 years. And then they make us basically do whatever they want in East Asia and the rest of the world. We give huge amounts of foreign aid to China, to South Korea. The treaties we sign with them specifically say that takes care of all of these wartime issues. We apologize 24 times. And the South Koreans and the Chinese never accept it. They're unfair. They're using this to get more out of us, to mobilize their domestic populations. And there's a grain of truth in that, all of that. But, it doesn't make sense in today's world to take that kind of, to think that way. But Mr. Abe thinks that.
Well, there's a kidnap issue, too.
Yeah, the kidnapping issue is a huge issue with the North Koreans. A lot of Japanese have been kidnapped by the North Koreans. So that adds another layer of complexity. Do we have time for one or two more questions?
Wasn't President Park's mom killed by North Korean agents?
Yeah, it's a little fuzzy, but a Korean living in Japan came to South Korea and shot at the president and his wife who was next to her. Do you know for sure? Has that ever been totally clarified?
I don't know. He was a Korean.
He was a Korean,
living in Japan.
Living in Japan. But, yeah, and, there's just so many people in South Korea like that. I mean, Kim Young-sam, the former president about 15 years ago or so, his mother was killed by North Korean partisans, for example. This is, the American Civil War where lots of families were split. That's
I mean, North Korean submarines wind up on shore every now and then, so that it's not good for friendship.
Yeah, there have been lots of problems. Yes?
So I have a question about the history when Korea was divided. So, as I understand, Germany was divided because it was the aggressor and it was the enemy of, and the victorious and the power state divided up Germany. But during the Second World War, it was Japan who was the aggressor. And still, American Soviet Union decided to divide Korea and not Japan. Can you say something about that?
Yes, I mentioned it before, but my understanding is that the United States was afraid that the Soviet Union was going to occupy all of Korea right away, just within days after the atomic bombings of Japan. And the U.S. did not want the Soviet Union to completely control the Korean Peninsula. So this was a stopgap measure. It wasn't deeply thought out. It wasn't intended to be permanent. It wasn't intended to be punishment of the Korean people. And, already asked, anybody else?
I was just saying on that issue, it was also, we didn't want to have more of our troops overseas farther, but we wanted to get the Japanese out of Korea, out of China, out of Malaysia, and if we could get another country to help us with their ships and their soldiers to de-Japanize that area, then hey, our boys can come home sooner.
Yes, part of our motivation, just as you say, is we're taking the surrender of the Japanese, and we just wanted to maintain stability on the Korean Peninsula until something stable Korean could be set up. I've gone over. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David Straub, for your